can't die from insomnia.
She couldn't help.
Are we done?
You love me, you hate me. Is that a pretty accurate description of our relationship?
How's it working out for you?
He thought he found a solution.
I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
I haven't seen you in any support groups.
Found a new one.
Really?
Brad Pitt, Edward Norton,
You're not into her, are you?
No.
Fight Club,
You're the worst thing that ever happened to me.
You kids.
rated R.
And we're back, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me in the car on this Tuesday early evening here in New York. Once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. So we're going to temporarily pause from our Halloween horror series and instead focus on what I believe to be a fantastic all-time legendary, iconic film, which unfortunately bombed at the box office in its day. But today marks 25 years since David Fincher's phenomenal adaptation of Chuck Palahniuk's novel, Fight Club, opened in theaters. Now, Fight Club was a movie that I saw before reading the book. And I would say the same about a movie from earlier in the 1990s, The English Patient, where I watched the movie first and then read the book, and both are great. But I actually feel like The English Patient, the movie, is better than the book, if I'm allowed to say that, because the book had there were a lot of kind of plot threads and beats that I don't necessarily think were super essential to the story that I feel like they were trying to tell. I guess they made the most cinematic interpretation of the book they could, because it absolutely tells the same story. It's just like they kept all of the quote-unquote good parts in the movie. And Fight Club, by its very nature, and I am going to stay very far away from spoilers, but due to its nature, it's very difficult to do a truly faithful adaptation of Fight Club. And I believe that David Fincher did an incredible job of being as faithful as he could, while also telling an extremely cinematic story. And he uses all manner of camera trickery, but it never feels forced. It doesn't ever seem like a brilliant filmmaker flexing or showing off his technical wizardry. He's just telling the story the best way he knows how. And I believe it's Fincher's, I don't know if you want to say it's his best film, but it's certainly his finest film as far as his direction. And I love what he does. The movie that he did with Jodie Foster and Kristen Stewart, Panic Room, beautifully directed. I don't think that film is anywhere near as good as Fight Club. I'll throw that out there. But his direction there is also stupendous. So Fight Club is a film that people would assume was a hit, because you still, had Brad Pitt in the 90s was coming across as still a very young man. He was in his mid-30s at the time, and Edward Norton and Helena Bonham Carter seemingly playing against type, but man, she's good in that movie. It didn't do well. It underperformed at the box office. And Brad Pitt is kind of an outlier in that he has had such an incredible, varied career, somebody who has made so many different kinds of movies. He's played conventional leading men. He's played serial killers where he's dumbed down or, had a different look on screen than he would conventionally have. Always willing to take risks when he didn't have to. And I appreciate that, the effort, the grind. I'm not talking about his personal life. I know that he and Angelina had just an awful breakup, and there's a lot of acrimony and bad feelings to this day. And I don't know if Brad Pitt is really an okay guy or not. I have no idea. But just as an actor, as somebody who is willing to take risks, as somebody who, as a producer, has made movies that were worth seeing, like 12 Years a Slave, which you want to talk about absolutely brutal. I mean, my gosh. But that movie only got made because Brad Pitt was willing to shepherd it through and go through a very difficult process. And there are other movies in Pitt's career where he thought were going to be worth it. For example, The Fountain. And he ended up, that was also going to be David Fincher. He became so frustrated, it ended up being Darren Aronofsky. I believe that Fincher was involved in that. I could be wrong. But that was something that it was so out of control that he gave up. He just gave up, and it ended up going with Hugh Jackman. But Fight Club, and this is a very ethereal, to use an SAT word, this is an ethereal point. But me as a movie fan, as somebody who has an appreciation for the concept of the movie star, and this is something that Quentin Tarantino has talked about. I don't necessarily agree with Quentin's take. Quentin says so many different things that if you pin him down on one and only go with one quote, I feel like you're almost doing a disservice to it, because he has said so many different things on the topic of movie stars. And yes, conventional movie stardom is not what it was, but I don't necessarily blame comic book movies for it. I blame the fact that the social media society and the now culture, it's just different, because movie stars now have social media accounts. There's less of a sense of mystery to them than there used to be, and I feel like that's part of it. But having said that, I still believe in the idea of old-fashioned movie stars, whether it's the Julia Roberts of the 90s, whether it's the Leonardo DiCaprio of today or Keanu Reeves. I believe in the idea. I don't believe that there are no movie stars. Now, I would say Tom Cruise is the last old-school movie star. I would agree with that sentiment. But where I was going with this, when I think of Tom Cruise, when his career comes to a close, when he decides to walk away from the movie business on his own terms, hopefully, I believe he will be most closely identified with Pete Mitchell, Top Gun. That is the iconic role. That is the role he will, in my opinion, most be remembered for when he is on the back nine, when he is getting the Lifetime awards. When Leonardo DiCaprio decides to take that walk into retirement 10 years from now, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. I believe that his iconic role, the role that he will most be thought of, is Catch Me If You Can. Not because it's his best performance, although it's certainly in his top 3. He is extraordinary in that film. But because he was young and he played the hell out of a great part. And when we think of movie stars when they're older, there's nothing wrong with remembering them when they were kids. And DiCaprio was, pushing 30 when he did Catch Me If You Can. He was playing somebody who was younger, and it was believable. Brad Pitt, I believe, will be defined by Tyler Durden, the character that he plays in Fight Club. And that's his most iconic role, in my opinion, even though he's given great performances in a ton of movies. I love what he does in Moneyball as the general manager of the Oakland Athletics, the kind of the sabermetric Moneyball A's. He's so good. And that was actually great casting, because the real Billy Bean looks like a model. It's kind of a joke. You get Brad Pitt, and this is not where you have Johnny Depp playing Joe Pistone is saying, Joe Pistone don't look like Johnny Depp, making jokes about it. But the real Billy Bean, he doesn't look like Brad Pitt, but it wasn't that much of a stretch. You had a very attractive man playing a very attractive man, and it worked. Fight Club, though, is not a movie as you sit down, and this is a very mild spoiler, as you sit down to watch for the first time, it doesn't feel like a movie with a massive plot twist in store. And the fact that it's to the film's credit that the movie doesn't necessarily rely on it. It's simply part of the fabric of this particular story that Chuck Pahlanuik told in the book, and that David Fincher and Edward Norton, Helena Bonham Carter, Meatloaf a day in a kind of funny role, and Brad Pitt, and the story that they're able to tell, the incredible story that they tell. And this film it's an experience. This is not a movie that you can passively sit through and just kind of casually take in. This is a visceral experience all the way through. And there aren't that many movies you can say that about. And I feel like Fight Club, because 1999, there are many people who have argued, and as I mentioned on a previous podcast, I had a kind of interesting back and forth with a film scholar, because I am a film scholar. I have the college degree that says it, but I'm an author, I'm a writer, but I've never written a book on movies. And there is a scholar and author named Brian Raftery who wrote a book. I don't even want to use the word arguing. He was putting forth the opinion, his opinion, which is as valid as anybody's, that 1999 was the single best year for movies. And I don't know if he specifically said Hollywood, if he delineated that, I don't remember, because I read the book and I'm not remembering if he says Hollywood. But he believes that 99 was the single best year for movies. Now, I recently, like within the last 3 days, as part of the Halloween horror series, talked about a movie from 1999, which was groundbreaking, which was pioneering, which changed the movie business, The Blair Witch Project. 1999 was also the year of The Matrix. It was also the year of The Sixth Sense. It was the year of American Beauty. It was the year of Fight Club. And it was also the year of Star Wars The Phantom Menace, the beginning of the prequel trilogy, Austin Powers 2, which was an enormous hit. It is, objectively speaking, a great year. Now, I would argue and have argued that 1993, just from the perspective of Hollywood, had a higher percentage of masterpiece films. But that's really neither here nor there. Fight Club fits snugly within a great movie year. And there are those moments in time where a movie doesn't do as well as it otherwise should have or could have, simply because it's released on the wrong weekend. And there are you run into a juggernaut. You run into a quote-unquote bigger movie. Arnold Schwarzenegger's Last Action Hero would have done better if it hadn't been released in the shadow of Jurassic Park. Now, that movie was always ahead of 1993. I forgot Jurassic Park was that year. But Last Action Hero was always going to be a little ahead of its time, and a movie that audiences were probably going to scratch their heads. But if it had opened the week before Jurassic Park, I believe it would have done better. It just happened to hit at the wrong time. And then there are movies that take us by surprise and end up being a much bigger hit than expected, regardless of when they're released. Fight Club just was too serious, and it wasn't the kind of movie that I think people wanted to go see at that particular juncture. But look, one of the great movies to me of the decade is Milos Forman's Man on the Moon, with Jim Carrey as the real performance artist / insult comic Andy Kaufman. I think that's one of the greatest movies ever made. It's up there with Amadeus, Milos Forman's acknowledged masterpiece, and of course One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And even with Jim Carrey's star power and him coming off the incredible success of The Truman Show, and the fact that Liar Liar was a monster hit, Man on the Moon, 1999, also underperformed. So there's just no way to know. And that's the William Goldman, the great quote by William Goldman, who I've also recently spoken out on the channel with Marathon Man, which recently celebrated its 48th anniversary. William Goldman's quote about Hollywood: nobody knows anything. And Fight Club is a movie that should have been a massive box office hit despite its serious themes, but it just wasn't. It underperformed, and I don't think it even came close to turning a profit worldwide. And it's not necessarily the kind of film that would play overseas. But the experience of seeing it, of watching it in theaters all those years ago, mind-blowing. And I'm not exaggerating, because it's a film that, if you just go by the description doesn't do justice for just how deep and serious and how thematically important this movie is. And there are a lot of movies, I should say, where you feel like you're being lectured to, or that the filmmakers are almost talking down to the audience. This movie has stuff that in lesser hands, you'd be like, get the fuck out of here. But somehow it works. And to be more precise with that, there is an idea that Generation Xers, that there are too many of us who were raised by single moms and never learned to fend for ourselves. And we're angry, well, at the time of this movie, we're angry and we need an outlet. That's not necessarily wrong. But in the world of the film, if you just describe the plot, I feel like the description and people assume, well, this doesn't really sound that interesting. A bunch of disaffected white guys, mostly white guys, are frustrated with their lives and the world at large in general, and decide to form an impromptu fight club where they just take turns bashing each other to hamburger, MMA style. That doesn't sound that interesting to me. But seeing the movie yeah, that description is accurate, but the movie is so much more than just that. There are so many things going on at the edges of the narrative. There are larger comments being made about society and American culture as it existed in the late 1990s, but you're not ever talked down to, you're not ever lectured to. It's just part of the experience of seeing this film. Now, I have to say, the first time I watched the movie, for 90% of the film, this is really not a spoiler, but if you've seen it, then this is a spoiler, but if you haven't, it's not. But for 90% or more of the movie, I did not like Edward Norton's performance. And I will also say, there are those who believe Edward Norton is the most talented actor of his generation. I'm not going to take issue with that. I've been a fan of his since Primal Fear, where he came almost literally out of nowhere and snagged an Oscar nomination and steals the movie from its star, Richard Gere. He is amazing. And the fact that he's a genius, got an IQ probably 160 or 170. Amazing. But I did not think that Norton's performance was good for 90% of the film. And then all of a sudden, his performance seemed touched by genius. And I don't know if that was what he was going for, or that David Fincher was doing that, or having him perform in a certain way. I want you to be a little more withdrawn. I want you to be a little bit more closed in with your line readings. I have no idea. I've seen behind the scenes stuff with this movie, but there's nothing about that, what I just said. But in total, when we get to the end of the movie, Norton's performance seems touched by genius. And I can't think of another film where that has taken place, or where I had that reaction, where an actor's performance seemed not great, somebody that was capable of great, I should say, where an actor's performance, it seems like they're really not engaged by the material and I'm not getting it, and then all of a sudden, holy shit, Norton is fucking brilliant. And this movie does that. That's as far as I'm going to go with spoilers. This movie does that. And it was very controversial at the time. There was one, I mean, this almost doesn't seem worth it, but there was one line of dialogue which Helena Bonham Carter recorded two different ways. And one had something to do with, forgive me for saying this, one had something to do with terminating a pregnancy. And another had something to do with how she hadn't had sex in a certain fashion since she was in school. Both lines are hugely inappropriate. And you can understand why, even at the studio level, somebody's seeing it, you can't say this. What are you, nuts? What ended up being in the movie was arguably worse than what they forced them to change, which, me as a film scholar, I think that's fucking hilarious. I get a kick out of that. When somebody tries to exert any level of censoring that the director doesn't really want, and the director gets away with it, or does something worse. Like Stanley Kubrick in A Clockwork Orange, there were certain things that he put in there. There were subliminal images that he was able to get past the censors, where you just know that Stanley, with his 200 IQ, in his own way, was given the double middle fingered salute to those who were going to tell him how to make his movie. You know, there's a difference between a studio or even a Harvey Weinstein, not from a negative sense, just from the producer angle. There are moments where they're giving feedback and giving notes, and they want to change what the director is doing. And then there is the fear of someone at the studio level saying, this movie's going to get an X rating, bro. We can't do this. You can't have this in here. Well, I'm going to do it anyway. We'll take our chances. And there have been instances where filmmakers had a movie that got an X rating on the first pass, and then they really didn't change much, and somehow it got an R rating. But Fight Club was altered slightly. There was dialogue which was adjusted, and I believe David Fincher got to make his movie. And speaking of Kubrick, and also 1999, the same year, Eyes Wide Shut was an enormous box office hit relative to cost, even though that movie took forever to make because of Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise could always open a movie. And Brad Pitt, although he was already a big star, Fight Club just didn't hit. And what I was saying, though, about Kubrick with Eyes Wide Shut, there was controversy. There was a scene with an orgy where Stanley had to take a couple of frames out, but not that much. But there was an idea, and then when he passed, people were angry because there was a thought that you didn't even let the guy complete his vision for his final film. He worked on this movie for 2.5 years. You had Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman in England for 2 years, and you can't even let this guy make his movie? But then there was pushback that said Stanley put those scenes in knowing they were going to ask him to just remove those. But there was other stuff that he was able to get through. In other words, that Kubrick was at level 8 and the people who told him to make cuts were at level 1, that he outsmarted them, that he put things in kind of like distraction. Look at this and you're not going to see that. And people that work closely with Stanley said, no, he made exactly the movie he wanted. His final cut was exactly the final cut he wanted. And I believe that David Fincher with Fight Club made exactly the movie that he wanted to make. And there was no interference that bothered him. Whereas on Alien 3, a movie I'm not really a big fan of, I'm sorry to say, as much as I love Fincher and Sigourney and Lance Henriksen and Charles S. Dutton, what a phenomenal actor, right? I don't like Alien 3. And in that instance, Fincher, who was very young, he was not able to make the movie that he wanted to. There was a ton of studio interference. But I would also argue that in that instance, they made the wrong script. There were a number of different screenplays for Alien 3, or versions, I should say, of Alien 3, bouncing around Hollywood, and I don't think they made the right one. They should have made one that took the ending of James Cameron's Aliens very seriously, rather than just flushing it down the toilet to make an entirely different movie. That's just my opinion. Could be wrong, as Dennis Miller used to say on his HBO show a million years ago. But Fight Club is one of those movies that, yes, it's challenging. Yes, it goes to places that you're not expecting it to. Yes, it has an anarchy to it. It has almost a narcissist streak. It has a sociopathic mindset. But it is a fantastic film. It is a great movie. Even if you could point to certain sections, well, I don't think this really works. I don't think this could happen the way that it does. But it is great. It is a worthy adaptation of what many people certainly consider Pahlanuik's best novel. He's written a lot of great books. He did the book Choke. Many people thought that Choke was his best work, and that was a pretty good film with, I believe, Sam Rockwell. But Fight Club, 25 years old today, released October 15, 1999, directed by David Fincher and starring Brad Pitt, Edward Norton, and Helena Bonham Carter. I don't think that it's free on any streamers. I know that there are times it's been on Netflix. It was free on Amazon Prime a while back, but I don't know. I didn't look before starting this episode. I apologize. But generally speaking, you can rent a movie such as this for a couple of bucks on either Amazon Prime, literally $2 on either Prime or Apple. But, you could poke around. Every now and then you'll see a print of a movie on YouTube before somebody takes it down, and you can just watch it on YouTube free of charge. But Fight Club is yet another movie that gets my absolute highest recommendation. It is a must-see film. Even if it's not your cup of tea, you will not watch this movie passively and say, 0 stars, boring as fuck. You may not like it, but it will be an experience. It will be something you will never forget. And you will be like, holy shit, I can't believe we're going here in a movie that I thought was just going to be about a bunch of fucking assholes in their 20s beating each other up. And I thought that was the movie. And look how wrong I was. This has been episode 328 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Tuesday evening here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, first rule of Fight Club, you don't talk about Fight Club. The second rule of Fight Club, you don't talk about Fight Club. The third rule of Fight Club, if it's your first time here, you have to fight.